Great. Thanks very much, Tom. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jess Brown, and I'm part of a research project team at the University of Warwick alongside Dr. Tom Perry and Dr. Becky Morris. I'd like to welcome you to our presentation on the survey of higher education research in the UK, as I'm sure some of you would have seen and participated in, and we thank you very much for your participation. We'll be presenting some initial thoughts from this survey, which forms part of the BERA's State of the Discipline project, looking at the remit of the survey as well as methods and initial points of interest. These are not the full results, but just some initial thoughts from what we've seen from the data so far. The survey included education researchers and anyone engaged in education research in UK universities. Our intention is to find out as much as possible about how education research is being done, what it is like, and who is doing it in universities in the UK. We wanted to look at things like research, working conditions, values, environment, and identities. This survey had two key aims. First, to provide a robust data about the state of education as an academic discipline in universities in the UK, examine the structures and processes that influence opportunity for and engagement in research activity for staff working in university education departments. It also follows some of the outcomes of the systematic scoping review from Boyle et al. 2021, examining processes and structures, formal and informal, which influence education research activities in the UK. It is also part of the BERA's State of the Discipline project and forms part of a wider package to analyse education research. This survey comes at an incredibly important time for higher education and education research in the UK. Both higher education and education as a subject area is in a state of flux. There are many ongoing challenges and policy shifts shaping the context for education research in the UK. Some of these include, but are not limited to, some of the things outlined on this slide, and include things like marketisation and competition, accountability and performance, changes in ITE policy, and working conditions, and research funding, training and progression.
I'm going to briefly introduce some of the methods of the survey, enough that we can make sense of our preliminary results. This is a large-scale online survey of the 4 UK nations. We went through a prolonged development process of the survey. We drew heavily on the Boyle and colleagues' systematic scoping review, part of the State of the Discipline project. We had an excellent advisory group who gave us some fantastic advice as we went through several iterations of the survey as we developed it. We tried to cover a large number of areas while keeping the survey to an accessible, roughly 15-minute completion window. In terms of dissemination, we used multiple channels. However, the key one was that we tried to email individually researchers across the country. We went through a 2-week process of sourcing email addresses from institutional websites and created a database of roughly 7,000 to 8,000 email addresses. Many of you here in this room will have received those emails, and we, on the one hand, we are very reticent about sending emails out to busy researchers, and we hope these have not come across as another thing within your email inbox. Equally, we really wanted to hear from everyone. We wanted to hear from as many people as possible, and we had a lot of support from the community in getting the survey out there. We were so pleased that in the end we got over 1,600 responses to the survey, which we estimate to be around a quarter to a fifth of the overall education researcher population. Thank you so much to everyone who did complete the survey. In terms of representation, we have some detailed analysis to do of this, comparing it with the HESA data. But just as an initial impression, we think our results slightly underrepresent early career researchers, and they slightly underrepresent those on the periphery of education research in terms of their employment contract and in terms of their topic of interest. So they might see themselves as more rooted in a cognate discipline and not necessarily being in the core of education research. So we can bear that in mind as we go through our figures, starting with a look at the sample. One of the things that's going to be incredibly important for our analysis is taking the characteristics of our sample and of education researchers and comparing that to the activities, and experiences of those researchers. So it's actually in conjunction with other data we think this is going to be most important. Nonetheless, we have a good overview of what the sector looks like. So I'm not going to read through the slides. We are going to make these available, but if I just wanted to pick out a few things within this. So in terms of background and characteristics, roughly 80% of education researchers have a previous career. Predominantly, this is in the school teaching sector, and that's indicated by roughly 50% having a school PGCE, and then when we start adding in other educational teaching qualifications, that figure gets higher. Equally, when we look at people's background, we have everything imaginable, from artists to business owners to politicians to youth workers, you name an industry, and it is represented within the community. In terms of personal circumstances, these are things which we will talk more about in the open response, but there are a large number of people with significant wider responsibilities and attributes which reflect their working conditions. Roughly half have a caring responsibility, roughly 3/4 of that it's children, and roughly 1/4 it's caring for young people or adults with disabilities or for elderly people. Roughly 15% have another career alongside their current work as an education researcher, many in the education sector, but as I say, there's a lot in business, youth services, and much wider than that. 15% of our sample reported having a disability or impairment that affected their day-to-day work, and roughly 20% were in the process of getting a further qualification. 2/3 of those further qualifications were doctoral. These are PhDs, doctorates in education, educational psychology, professional doctorates, and then beyond that, there's teaching qualifications and master's courses currently being studied by the community. Finally, and I won't go into detail on this because I think it really connects with the first presentation, but we're getting a very similar picture of the contracts that people are on, and we're going to explore the inequalities within these. Just to point out the point about potential sampling bias here, we're finding the majority have permanent open-ended contracts, roughly 85%. About 12% have a fixed-term contract, but only 3% within our sample have sessional, casual, 0 hours work. Just one final point is that 1 in 5 say that their jobs are currently insecure, and that's something that you'll see within some of the qualitative responses. We have far too much in the way of rich qualitative data to share that with today, and we've been very selective in the perspectives we've been able to share. I'm going to put a couple of quotations onto the next slide, and I'll give you a few moments to read these as illustrative of some of the issues being raised. We will make these slides available afterwards, so you'll be able to see these in more detail. As I say, there are a huge number of poignant and important voices that we wish to share. I'm going to just finalise my section here with just 2 more.
Okay, we'll move on. But so that kind of set the scene of the sample there. What we wanted to talk about next was the environment and institution and some of the findings from the sections on the survey around that. We're particularly focusing today on what our participants said about their colleagues, the research environment that they were working in their institution as well. We found that the majority of our participants were very positive about their colleagues. 80% think that their colleagues are kind and supportive. This number slightly decreased, though, as we asked more specific questions around particular tasks within the academy or around research particularly. So the third statistic there, 50% report that there is a positive collegial research environment in the institution where they work. Of course, that's 50% of people saying that they're either not sure about that or that they disagree with that. There were many positive reports about institutions generally, but also, again, a really mixed picture here, and many colleagues reporting less positive views as well. About 50% felt that they belong with their institution, and 50% would recommend their university as a place to work. 20% felt that they did not belong in their current institution. In terms of physical and psychological safety, on the whole, people felt physically safe in their place of work, with 90% of participants reporting that that was the case. But 10% are not agreeing with that and not feeling that they are physically safe in their university environment. Also concerning is the figure of 60% reporting that they feel psychologically safe at their institution, with obviously 40% not feeling that way. And again, just a couple of, if the slide will move, illustrative excerpts and quotations here. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to look at those. And just to say with that second excerpt, what we found particularly interesting here and what has come up in a number of responses is how many education researchers, if they're not feeling that they have that supportive collegial environment within their own institution, are very much looking outwards to other places, other support and other organisations for that.
We've also highlighted a number of key things that have become apparent around careers and working conditions. There have been some initial interesting findings so far. Items around career development indicate that 37% of people think they are being financially well compensated, and 21% think that they are getting enough professional development, support and opportunities. What we can see is that people conducting education research are busy with having many concerns about being unable to complete work, having an unacceptable workload, and problems around a good work-life balance. There doesn't appear to be much time for professional development, writing, and other research activities like applying for funding. Workload continues to be a subject which is repeated throughout the survey, with people using many opportunities to talk about workload in many different areas of the survey itself. Here are a couple of examples of career development and workload quotations that we picked up from the survey. In the examples here, they illuminate the struggle colleagues are feeling with balancing their lives alongside work, as well as trying to progress their own development and conduct their own research. And again, I just invite you to read those quotes that are outlined up there.
Another area of survey was to look at people's research activities, the methods and the topics that they focus on. We are at a very early stage in the analysis here. We can see in the top left, we did ask an open question about motivations, and we've got some really, really interesting data there. We've got many, over a dozen so far, themes emerging from that. So just some preliminary remarks about that. When people talk about their motivations for doing research and their particular topics, we have some really strong values-led, values-based answers to that. Many people refer to social justice and inequalities in particular or in general as key motivations for their work. Many people talk about the process or the outcomes and products of doing research in a favourable way and then commenting why it matters to them. People sometimes talk about necessity, but they very frequently talk about enjoyment of conducting research, of working with people, of finding things out. There's a really strong theme about self-development and developing others. And there's a really strong theme, again, about collegiality and collaboration as part of research. People talked about the importance of their particular specialisms and content areas and spoke very passionately in many cases about those. And many responses link back to people's personal identities, where they say they had personal reasons for getting into research and for the topics that they study. Again, with activities, we want to analyse these data in conjunction with other areas to see inequalities in people's experience and success in their activities. One really positive thing that definitely came across the survey is how engaged and collaborative education research is as a sector. We obviously don't have comparative data with other areas, but we have a huge number of responses around collaboration, links with policy, links with practice, links with international, national colleagues, and lots of people talking about how they see the collaborative nature of education research as central to why they do it. When we look at the methods people are using, there's a very wide acknowledgement of the importance of methods alongside topic expertise. Unfortunately, research training was not meeting people's expectations. Roughly 50% said that they had received basic, limited training or no training at all on research methods. 37% thought their research methods training was good, and 12% said it was excellent. Many have felt they've learnt their craft on the job and without formal support. When it comes to the specific methods used, unsurprisingly, there are some mainstay methods in use, like interviews, questionnaires, observations, focus groups. But again, another really positive and interesting area of the research is people talking about the methods they use. We're seeing a really diverse, innovative methods base and a real expertise across many, many different areas. And we're going to report further on that when we get to that stage. Just in terms of some overviews, about a third report they're using numbers in some form, descriptive univariate statistics. This drops down to about 20% for more kind of advanced quantitative methods. And there's, of course, a flip side to that for more advanced qualitative methods and where people specialise there. 54% report using mixed methods approaches. I'll leave you 2 quotes on this. If I could just comment on the second and third. Many people talk about the undervaluation of the area of methods they use, and we see this from all camps and all specialisms, so it's interesting to compare the second and third quote. And these are illustrative of many others.
Okay, last section, and this one refers to the current issues and debates that colleagues reported were influencing or contributing to their education research. In the survey, we asked an open-ended question about this towards the end of the survey, drawing upon some of the issues and debates that were raised in the Boyle Systematic Review. Participants also, in addition to some of those issues, commented on other things, other issues that they were seeing as important and influential at the present time as well. The first one relates to the fact that this survey was very much a UK 4 nations survey, and that was obviously very important in the design and dissemination of the survey, but some of the comments we were seeing coming through relate to the specific context of the different nations across the UK and what that might mean in terms of government or funding or discourses around the education research that they were able to conduct. Second, we see the performativity and accountability cultures that we mentioned earlier on and which I know have been discussed in a number of other papers here at the conference. There were a number of kind of statistics coming through on this. So, for example, the REF was repeatedly mentioned by our participants in the survey, unsurprisingly. But when asked to report on how valid a measure people felt the REF was, 13% agreed that it was a valid measure of research quality. And in relation to thinking about processes for awarding external funding, just 9% of our participants agreed that the allocation of external funding was a fair process. We also have seen a number of comments around issues relating to global higher education and some of the shifts and policy changes that we've seen in this country, but also internationally. We've got some more work to do around the analysis of these, but there were a number of comments around the impact of Brexit and also comments around international students coming to the UK, the role and value of them for supporting and contributing to research, and also some of these more global topics relating to education research as well. As Jess mentioned, the fourth picture over there, workload was absolutely pervasive throughout this whole survey. Wherever there were opportunities for people to write openly about issues, workload has repeatedly come up as a challenge which is influencing and affecting the amount, the quantity of education research that can happen, but also the quality of it as well. The fifth picture there with the two grumpy-looking faces sort of represents what we're seeing around political discourses in the country, and we saw a number of these debates and issues also being raised in the survey, so they're being reflected within education and the higher education sector as well. So topics relating to sort of, culture wars, freedom of speech, racial inequalities, and really mixed pictures on the role of these and what they're doing, if you like, to education research and higher education, I'd say more broadly in this country. And finally, because we do want to try and end on an optimistic note, colleagues were reporting the real value that they see in education research for themselves. So over 3/4 of our participants reported that they find their job rewarding, and 86 reported that their research is a source of satisfaction for themselves. But equally, many talked about the value that their work has for children, schools, teachers, wider society, communities, and other organisations relating to education. So we think, we hope that people feel that there is real power and value in the work that they do, and that was coming through as a key issue there. In terms of what's next for our project, let's try and move the slide on. There we go. So outputs, we will be finalising our analysis and writing up our report in due course. That will be made publicly available, of course. If you're interested in following the project, we have our website and also our Twitter account, which you're all very welcome to join and follow. We're really keen, as we have been through the whole process of this project, to hear from you, to hear from the people that we're thinking about, writing about, researching. So any thoughts or reflections you have would be great, either in this space today or around the rest of the conference, or just feel free to get in touch with us. That would be great. We thought we'd end with a final thought from one of our participants who summed up what being an education researcher is like quite well in our view. They reported that it involves unremitting hard work, punctuated by the odd highly enjoyable conference. And we really hope that you've been enjoying the BERA conference so far and the presentations here, but we thought that was a nice summary. And we'd just like to extend our huge thanks to everyone who's helped with this project. It was quite a slog getting the survey out there and encouraging so many people to participate, but it's been really well worth it in terms of the results we're seeing and the conversations we can have with you. So thank you.
Thank you. Our contribution to this panel is really in a form of a brief introduction to a study which was commissioned by BERA, which explored inequalities in education, in UK higher education, by looking at existing statistical data on academic staffing held by HESA, the Higher Education Statistics Authority, which archives the data from higher education institutions. We looked at data at a five-year period from 2015 to 2020, so before the impact of COVID. I'm Dina Beluigi. I'm joined here by my collaborator, Dr. Joanne O'Keefe. Professor Ade was unable to join us, unfortunately. Soon the fuller report will be published. You have the abstract for this talk, which outlines the aims and which markers of difference and sameness we explored in the data. Those were age, sex, ethnicity or race, disability, religious belief, and nationality. We explored the data through these as entry points, looking at the data about each grouping, intersections with other markers, and also at the employment conditions. In the report, we also represent it this way. So if your interest is in ethnicity, for instance, you can start with the general percentages and then read into more detail.
Just to point out that we did not provide benchmarks for equality, but rather compared what was observed in the discipline of education to that of the UK higher education in general, so all of the disciplines combined, and where we noticed differences to the higher education sector in devolved nations.
In the report, we discussed the fuller picture, which revealed that the staff composition in the discipline of education in the United Kingdom at the time was homogeneous, and considerably more homogeneous than what was observed across the disciplines in the UK higher education sector. The discipline was white, and staff recorded as Black, Asian, and minority ethnic, or BAME, were not only underrepresented in education when it came to access and employment, but marginalized once employed. It was staffed by those from upper income countries, with academics from the majority world or global south excluded. And despite there being more female staff employed, there were continued inequalities shown when it came to the flourishing of female staff. We also tentatively raised concerns about younger staff. We raised concerns about less positions for research in education, and that there was less growth in the discipline compared to that of the sector. To put that last statement into figures, there was a 1% rate of growth in employment in education over the 5-year period that we studied, compared to a 9.5% growth rate across the other disciplines. The growth that did happen in education was primarily in teaching-only contracts, with fewer promotions in general and fewer staff at professorial level, despite there being more senior staff in education. But today we focus specifically on sex, ethnicity, and nationality. In each case, we'll begin with the overall percentages to indicate the access of academic staff, and then the proportions of groups to indicate the dynamics of participation once they were employed.
I'll highlight the findings about sex. The recording of sex allowed by HESA is male, female, and other. The recording of other commenced as a category in 2017, where amounts for other were recorded in the sectors of England, Scotland, and Wales, but not in Northern Ireland. But when it came specifically to the discipline of education, only in England were their staff recorded as other, but in too small of numbers for this analysis. So the report discusses male and female categories. Also note that for sex, there were no unknowns recorded due to legal requirements for reporting. This was not the case with the other markers. In terms of sex and staff composition across the UK higher education sector in 2020, if you look on the left, there were slightly lower proportions of female staff, 47% in green, than male staff. Education had a consistently higher percentage of female staff, 69% in blue on the right, with slight increases over the 5-year period studied in each of the devolved nations. There were differences in devolved nations, such as the highest proportion of female staff in education was in Wales at 70%. Its local higher education sector also had the highest proportion of female staff at 47%. The lowest proportion in education was in Northern Ireland at less than 64%, which too was consistent with its local higher education sector, which employed the lowest proportion of female staff in the UK at 44%. We also considered the sex of the staff in relation to relative to age. We observed that for female staff, from the height of their proportions at age 25, access to employment in education decreased consistently from the age of 66 and over, when 50% of staff were female. Male staff followed the reverse pattern. The impact of the older staff composition generally in education, and this pattern suggests that female staff in education had shorter career durations at senior and professorial level than male staff. It is only from the age of 41 that the percentage of female staff at professor level increases. For male staff, this increase is seen at an earlier age of 31. At age 66, the overall percentage of male professors in education was double that of female professors. The pattern of more female than male staff in education was also the case when sex was considered by ethnicity at the level of general comparison. That is, when grouping those recorded as BAME and those recorded as white. So the gaps on the right is from the reporting of unknowns when it comes to ethnicity. However, this differed for specific groups recorded within the category of BAME, as indicated in the graphics. The top visual indicates the percentage of specific groups in the overall staff composition in education. Note that there are more males than females for those staff recorded as Black, Black British African. In all the devolved nations, there was an underrepresentation in education of male staff recorded as Asian, Asian British Indian, Asian, Asian British Pakistani, Black, Black British African, and Black, Black British Caribbean. When considering employment conditions, both sexes had higher proportion employed full-time, the FT in the second bar, than part-time. Within male staff, here in purple, higher proportions were full-time than one observes in the grouping of females. There was a slight increase in the employment of those working part-time for both males and female staff over the study period. And you can see from the comparison with the UK higher education sector that we have higher proportions in both sexes working part-time. In this slide, you can see that a higher proportion of male staff were employed in teaching and research contracts. And there were also higher proportions within the male grouping in senior academic positions than junior. This was in part impacted by the mode of employment, which you might remember had lower proportions of male staff employed full-time than part-time at junior levels. This pattern was inverted at senior levels. Although fewer men than women were employed in education, a higher proportion of the male group were working at professor level. Similarly, a slightly higher proportion of male staff than female staff progressed to senior management level within the study period. Mode of employment again seemed to affect this. Of full-time staff, 6% were in professorships compared to 11% of male full-time staff. Of the part-time female staff in education, 3% were in professorships compared to 8% of male part-time staff. This indicates that female staff in part-time positions at professorial level may have been disadvantaged. When sex is considered relative to ethnicity and professorial positions in education, certain groups were underrepresented. There were no female professors in education recorded as Asian, Asian British Bangladeshi, nor Black British African during the period of study.
When it comes to ethnicity, HESA limits the collecting to 24 categories. These were curated into 2 sets by HESA, which we purchased for the study. When looking at the staff composition in terms of ethnicity, the unknown category, which includes not known, not available, and information refused, is sizable. Except for this visual of overall percentages, we report on the known. You can see that education had a higher proportion of staff recorded as white than the UK higher education sector, at a difference of 10%. Despite a notable growth over the time period we studied, the proportion of education staff recorded as BAME in 2020 was still less than half the proportion recorded in the UK higher education sector. In the devolved nations, the highest proportion of staff recorded as white was in Northern Ireland at 99%, followed by Wales at 96%, with Scotland and England at around 91%. When looking at the composition of those education staff recorded as BAME, 2/5 were recorded as Asian, 1/5 mixed, and 1/5 Black. Over the period studied, where education showed a far smaller growth rate in employment, was for those recorded as Black, a rate of 13.5% in education compared to a growth rate of 53% across the other disciplines. And also small was for those recorded as mixed, at a rate of 26% in education compared to the growth rate of 46% across the sector. There were similar patterns of males to females when considering staff recorded as white and as BAME, but differences emerged when exploring in more granularity in relation to sex, as Joanne discussed previously. Staff recorded as white with UK primary nationality had a considerably higher proportion in education than across the other disciplines. Look at the bottom 2 bars of these 2 clusters. Of those recorded with EU primary nationalities, there was a higher proportion of those recorded as white. See the yellow bar compared to the light green. Now look at the green bars for staff recorded as BAME. There was a 22% difference in proportions of those staff with UK primary nationality in education compared to the UK higher education sector. There was considerably more global diversity amongst those recorded as BAME, with a higher proportion of non-EU UK at 30% than the proportion of those recorded as white, which was 2.5%, the mustard color. In the report, we look at religious belief and note that overall there were higher proportions of Christians recorded in education than the whole UK higher education sector. Here we will briefly note the differences according to ethnicity. You'll see that although there was more plurality of belief within those education staff recorded as BAME, the combined groupings of spiritual and other, Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, and Sikh in education was in a lower proportion to the proportions observed in the UK higher education sector.
Proportionally, staff recorded as BAME were awarded less teaching and research and more research-only contracts, and we observed a reduction in the proportion of teaching and research contracts awarded to staff as BAME from 72% in 2015 to 57% in 2020. Of concern is that the increased proportion for staff recorded as BAME was primarily in the teaching-only contracts at junior level, from 15.5% in 2015 to 30% in 2020. On the right is the differentiated data. Next. Staff recorded as BAME had higher proportions in junior positions than senior in education, as you can see on the right, compared to staff recorded as white. A positive sign was that there had been an increase in the proportion of education staff recorded as BAME who had progressed to professors in 2020 to 6%. The proportion of staff recorded as BAME to attain a position in senior management was less than 2%, which was lower than the proportions observed in those staff recorded as white at 5%.
HESA datasets categorize the nationality of staff by UK, EU, non-UK EU, and individual countries, but they limit the recording to only one nationality per person, which they call primary nationality. We have that to show you, and we'll do that firstly. But to explore how the staff composition reflects global inequality, we also decided to code the countries of primary nationality according to World Bank country and lending groups' country classifications, which provided a framework for analyzing patterns of access between the global north, or minority world, and the global south, or majority world. So, firstly, you can see that education was predominantly composed of staff recorded as holding UK primary nationalities. While there had been a decrease in the rate of UK staff employed at -2% in the period that we studied, that proportion remains significantly higher than the UK sector at a 20% difference by 2020. The reductions had filtered into growth of staff holding EU primary nationalities. What was consistent across the devolved nations was that staff holding UK primary nationalities were employed in education in higher proportions than what was observed across the disciplines in those sectors. The highest of those holding UK nationality was in Wales at 96%, followed by England at 89%, Scotland 81%, and Northern Ireland 65%. Of those employing staff with EU primary nationalities, the largest proportion was in Northern Ireland, 34%, of which a sizable proportion held the primary nationality of the Republic of Ireland. Scotland recorded the next highest proportion, 10%, followed by England at 6.5%, Wales at less than 2%, but each with considerably lower proportions than what was seen across the disciplines in their local sectors. Of those employing staff with non-EU UK primary nationalities, Scotland had the highest proportion at 9%, then England at less than 5%, Ireland at 2%, and Wales at less than 2%. Again, all considerably lower than their local higher education sector. The visuals here show differences when nationality was considered in relation to ethnicity. This is a world map, thanks to the World Bank, with dark green for the few high-income countries, light green for upper middle-income countries, light purple for low-middle-income countries, and dark purple for low-income countries. What we found was that education held primary nationalities from all the categories of countries. However, the vast majority were from high-income countries. See the dark green bar at the bottom at 97% in 2020. And this was at a higher proportion than what was compared to the UK higher education sector, which was at 90% at the time. Most of those education staff were from the UK, Ireland, Greece, Germany, Italy, Australia, Canada, the Netherlands, and Spain. Less than 2% of education staff held primary nationalities in upper income countries, less than the proportion observed in the UK sector, which was at 6% in 2020. Access for education staff from middle-income countries was even further reduced. During the study period, we observed that this had increased, but to only less than 1% in education in 2020, lower than the underrepresentation observed in the UK higher education sector, which was at 4%. The proportion of staff employed from low-income countries was so low that it was rounded to zero in both education and in the UK higher education sector as a whole. We also observed that the lower the income status of the country of primary nationality, the higher the proportion of male to female staff. So the general pattern of more female staff to male staff that we observed in education, that was actually reversed for low and middle income countries, or LMICs. When considering employment conditions, there was a higher proportion of those from low and middle income countries, or LMICs, at junior levels than senior levels. And in terms of professorships, 97% of professors were recorded as holding primary nationalities in high-income countries, less than 1% from upper middle-income countries, and 1% of middle-income countries. There were none from low-income countries. For senior management appointments, the proportion of all of those from low and middle-income countries was rounded to zero. In our report, we write in the discussion that in a disciplinary context of such social homogeneity, further research is warranted to explore how social determinants affect the academic participation, the freedom, the flourishing, the well-being, and the leadership of those staff outside the dominant norms. We believe that attention should also be paid to how such homogeneity relates to the subjects, methods, and knowledges that are researched and taught in the discipline of education in the UK.
Here we highlight some of what we pointed to as areas requiring more research in the report. We really hope that the report will be catalytic, and thank you for listening.
Okay, first of all, thank you so much again for this incredibly insightful work. BERA is planning, once the reports are fully agreed and published, to hold a big event to bring these together, to celebrate, but also to ask ourselves some challenging questions, and more importantly, what can we do? What can BERA do? What can we do in our institutions? What collaborations do we need to have to really, frankly, improve on a lot of these issues? And before I open the floor to questions, I'm hoping, by the way, there are roving mics, but yes, brilliant. I think most of all, it's a case of, we know these are long-standing issues, I think. I've experienced in different institutions attempts to improve on these things, and it's absolutely no easy task. But those are for many years on. Anyway, let's get down. If anyone has got a question, could you raise your hand? Excellent, Vinny. So if we have the mic down here, please, at the front. It's just down here, yeah.
Thank you so much for the findings of your two studies. They made very interesting listening. The results in terms of my own personal position as a black female researcher in the field who very latterly got to the position of professor, the story was told in your statistics. So I think it's not so much as a question to you, but more of a challenge to everybody in this room and to BERA. Those of you who are black and global majority in this room will know that your stories have also been told through the statistics and figures and comments that have been highlighted during your two presentations. But the time has come, and through my work with schools, looking at anti-racism, with NHS staff, CCGs, governors, the time has come, colleagues, to actually look at positive action. No, we've got the statistics, we've got the evidence, we've talked about these issues for the last 30, 35 years that I've been in education, and little seems to have changed. So it's time to be courageous and think about what positive action can you take. So why not say, where are the black and global majority people on our research team? We should have somebody there. Where are the black and global majority staff who are early career researchers, whose careers we can plot and mentor to reach promotions? Where are the people within BERA who can support us with this? So really it's a challenge to all of us in this room. Take that challenge back to your institutions and talk about positive action.
Thank you. I don't know if any of the panellists want to say anything in relation to that. You're very welcome.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think we've got the data, we've got the analysis of it. We've also had the data from UKRI, for instance, in the really low awarding rates for black PIs on projects. The issue is, you're absolutely right, is the next steps. UKRI has provision within it for affirmative action or positive action. What these statistics show is some of the discriminations that are happening structurally within the discipline. And so, yes, it's the people in this room, really. And I'm not just asking who's on what groups, but what positions those people are put into, because you can be in a group as a co-I or a research assistant, but if you're not in a professor position, you're not going to get as much. So thank you. I'd just like to echo it and just to affirm that it is structural change that is needed, not benevolent gestures.
Do we have any other questions? Yes, lady in the middle there.
I'm Linda Lavelle from Bath Spa University, and I'd like to first echo Vinnie's very erudite words and how much I agree with her. But my question is actually for the second presenters. We gave a paper this morning, colleagues from Nottingham Trent University and myself, about the amount of teacher education research that was returned to the REF, like 5%, and we produced a methodology to show the robustness of our finding. I wondered, a lot of the quote our participants told us, slides that you put up, really echoed with what we found. And I wondered if you had any kind of handle on how many of your participants were actually teacher educators.
I couldn't give you the figure right now, but absolutely, because we've asked people what their primary focus of their research is and what their department specialism is. So it's absolutely going to be a key variable within our analysis to start breaking down these figures by working out. I'd add to that and say the analysis needs to look at people in different age groups, in different ethnic groups. We need to look at location in the country, we need to look at different institutions, and yes, absolutely, one of the things that definitely comes across in some of the open response and some of the issues being raised is the sheer amount of turmoil and uncertainty in the initial teacher education and how that's being funded and the policy figures of that. That is really telling for the experiences of staff, teacher education departments, and so that's going to be a central point of the analysis. As for a specific figure, I can't give you one, and I suspect, going back to the representative point, we will have to see whether teacher educators are underrepresented in the figures, and we try to be very careful about our wording around research and contracts to ensure that we valued all forms of practice-focused research, scholarship and research, and we will have to see how the figures come out on that, but it's enormously important.
Yeah, I was just going to add the point about the sort of opening stages were so important to us because, I mean, Tom and I have both worked in teacher education. It's an area we feel really passionate about, and supporting that research and the value of that research that happens, we really wanted to hear those voices. We did have some emails back from colleagues in teacher education departments saying things like, well, I don't really identify as a researcher, I don't have time for it. And those were quite disheartening to hear because we wanted those people to be involved in the survey, but also to have the opportunity of conducting research. So that's something for us to think a bit further about and follow up again with, I think. Thank you.
Any further questions, comments? I can hear you. Please do ask a question. Yeah, the light's blinding me a bit. There's a microphone for you there.
Oh, there's a mic as well.
Yeah.
Hello. Okay, the starting point for me is that this is my 22nd BERA conference. My first one was in 1999. And I have been listening to BERA presentations for those years. And let me say this, the people who come to BERA conferences are the people at the forefront of wanting to bring about changes. All of us who have been involved in it, we've got something to say, some questions to ask, and want to change. So the question is, does our research describe the situation, describes it well, but does it ask the questions of the mechanisms and ideologies which keep the system going as it has gone for 150 years? My research looks at 150 years of school education in England. out of 150 years, 100 years has been under Conservative government. 50 years have been shared between Lib Dems and Labour. So that's the political context of education. And it begins, like charity begins at home, the discrimination, lack of access to education begins at school level. And what's the mechanism which governs it? The generating mechanism has been Sir Cyril Bird's fake data, fake research on IQ and intelligence. You go today, I challenge you, you go today to a secondary school in England, and you'll find that his pamphlet, which he wrote nearly 100 years ago, is used today for pupils grouping. They don't call it IQ, they don't call it intelligence. Those words have been replaced by ability and aptitude tests, but tests remain the same. So the question is, the elephant in the room, who is going to say, that's where the mechanism is? The generating mechanism for denying access to good education starts with Sir Cyril Bird's ideas of IQ and intelligence. And we all know here that he was declared as a fraud. That is the question. Are we addressing that question sufficiently or not?
I think that's the sort of profound historical angle that you're giving us, and the reminder of these, the ideologies at play, the politics are absolutely part of where our underlying thinking is. But I'm also grateful that we've got new empirical data that's current, that enables us to actually try yet again to push things forward in the right direction. And Vinny, I absolutely agree. For example, from my own point of view, I think vice-chancellors, heads of education departments, which BERA consistently tries to engage with, and we will be doing this once again, and because we think we have stuff here for heads of departments that they should be, A, interested in, and B, horrified by. I mean, we'll wait for the final reporting and so on. So, yeah, thank you so much. Such profound questions being raised today, absolutely germane to what education is as a discipline, as a job, as a passion. So can we all give the teams a round of applause? And thank you to you too.